Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Kusum Wijetilleke. My guest today is Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, the Nationalist Member of Parliament for the National People's Power. Dr. Harini, thank you for being here. You are an academic in Sri Lanka's Parliament, now serving as the Nationalist MP for the National People's Power. I've read that you initially joined the Federation of University Teachers Association. So could you tell our audience a little bit about your path from being an academic to an activist and now a Member of Parliament?
So I've been an activist prior to joining the university sector also. I worked in different sectors in child protection and the psychosocial field as well. So, and then I eventually ended up joining the university in 2011. And that was a period of great turmoil in the university sector because university academics went on strike twice, in 2011 and in 2012. And the Federation of University Teachers Association, FUTA, was very active at that time. And I, as a member of the academic staff, I was part of the trade union and very quickly became quite involved in union work and in our campaign for increasing the allocation for education in the budget. So as a result, that kind of pushed me on to speaking out about things, on writing, all of us. I mean, many of us in the university sector became quite active in that, during that time and thereafter. So it was a kind of a gradual sort of getting more and more into playing a more public role, not just as a, sort of confining myself to teaching and research. And it was in that process that the JVP at the time got a lot of us together for policy discussions. They wanted different people to get involved in drafting their national policies. And I was part of the education drafting team, education policy drafting team, and there were many of us who were professionals who were not part of any political party who were working with the JVP at the time, and we felt that there was a need for a platform where people like us who were not full-time politicians or full-time political activists and not affiliated to any party, but to be able to come together to form a sort of a platform where people who thought alike, who had sort of similar political ideologies could become more sort of active. And that's how the NPP was formed, the National People's Power. And almost immediately there were two elections, 2019 and 2020. And in the 2020 general election, my name was nominated onto the national list. I didn't think I would actually have to enter parliament, but that's what happened.
Okay. Now, as an academic, someone that's in researching for this interview, I saw quite a few papers that you had done. So you've authored these papers, but now you find yourself in parliament as an MP within this climate of all 225 must go. Now in the media, there's a lot of disparaging comments about the lack of substance in parliament, both in terms of the members and also the debates. I wondered if you could make a positive case for some of your colleagues in parliament, I mean, within your party across political lines, but can you give people some confidence that there are MPs that are not only capable within parliament, but also have the level of requisite integrity? And perhaps maybe they're not being empowered, but how do you see this argument about the 225 must go? And
well, I think that none of us should take that personally. It's not about individuals. I think it's more a reaction to a systemic problem, and I think that's fair, right? So people are asking for a change in our political culture, and that goes for how parliament functions, how political parties function. So the slogan isn't necessarily about individual MPs. It's more about the system as a whole, and definitely that system needs reform. I have to say this though, that when people's idea of how parliament functions is based primarily or largely on what happens in the chamber, and that's probably the ugliest part of and the least useful part of parliamentary life and parliamentary proceedings. It shouldn't be, that's part of the problem, but it is. Parliament also has several committees. There's COPA, there's COPE, there's the Committee on Public Finance, there are ministerial consultative committees. So there's a lot of committee work that also happens. I wouldn't say all 225 are engaged in the committees in an equal manner, but those of us who are in committees actually find that the committees are far more useful in terms of getting things done and pushing things than what happens in the chamber. And a parliament that has a strong committee system is good for parliamentary democracy as a whole. And again, there's lot to change in our current committee system because of the current composition of the parliament, where there's one party that has a 2/3 majority and it's very dominant. They're also very dominant in the committees. So that doesn't always make for a good kind of discussion or a good output in terms of the changes that you can make. But I still think in the committees we work much better, much more cooperatively, collaboratively, and with much less sort of cross-party, hurling accusations at each other. That almost doesn't happen in the committees. Probably because you're not seen on the media also, and then people tend to behave differently.
Okay. Well, Sri Lanka is currently in a position that we've not experienced before. Now, May 9th, it's almost 30 days ago. We found ourselves somewhere between a failed state and almost a state of anarchy. I want to first ask you about the dynamics now in the political sphere. Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe's appointment as Prime Minister, could you specify what you think it means for the Aragalaya specifically, but also for the country and our economy as a whole?
Well, we think that was a setback. We think Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe taking on that position was actually not a step in the right direction. It gave this government a breathing space and time to regroup and kind of gather themselves together, which was, I think, changing. I mean, if you look at what the Aragalaya has achieved during the last several weeks, an entire cabinet resigned, the Prime Minister resigned, the Secretary to the Finance Ministry resigned, Governor of the Central Bank resigned. So there have been, the impact of the Aragalaya has been felt. Most importantly, the behavior of elected members have changed. I mean, they're much more cautious about showcasing their privileges or throwing their weight around because they know that that's not what the public approves of. And I think those are all good things, right? So so in a way, the pressure was building up for a much more significant change. And I think Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe's entry there has been a setback to that momentum. But we think that that's temporary, right? In this current parliament will not be able to deliver on the demands of the people. So that's going. Ranil Wickremesinghe will also have to confront that at some point, sooner rather than later. And then the struggle will continue. I mean, there's a lull, and that's the nature of struggles. That's the nature of political reform.
Where do you see the 21st Amendment going, Dr. Harini? Because it seems like there's been a few conversations about different drafts. Mr. Vijaydas Rajapaksa, the Justice Minister, has his own draft. The SJB has put forward its own draft. So where do you see us? Do you think there'll be any movement? Do you have any room for optimism here?
No, I don't really think that the 21st Amendment is going to go where the people want it to go. I think that was made very clear. I just saw an interview that the President had done with Bloomberg, where he basically said you either go with a parliamentary system or if there is an executive presidency, then that presidency must have all the powers. And he had intimated that he was not supportive of the 21st Amendment. And by and large, I think that is the position of the SLPP as well. They will not support a 21st Amendment, certainly not one that will mean that their national organizer might have to leave his position, right? We also have a few concerns about the 21st Amendment as the NPP in this current context, because it does transfer power from the president to a prime minister and the parliament, which doesn't necessarily have the mandate of the people to exercise that level of power, especially not the prime minister, right? The prime minister is someone who lost his seat and came into parliament, almost by accident became prime minister, not an elected prime minister, appointed prime minister. So whether that prime minister should enjoy wide-ranging powers is, we feel, undemocratic. We think the 21st Amendment should be followed immediately by an election so that people can select and elect a prime minister who then has the powers that are proposed in the 21st Amendment. But beyond that, we really, because of, again, as I said, the composition of the current parliament is not at all conducive to this kind of progressive, pro-democratic reforms, and we very much doubt whether the 21st Amendment will go very far.
Yeah, I was speaking to Mr. Peter Almeida. He's an activist and the actor who's involved in the article, and he himself said that there seems to be, the main problem that we have is a lack of a provision for recall amongst representatives. Now, it's a bit tricky even in the US and the UK with very advanced systems. Recalling a representative requires a certain thing. So maybe that's something that could be part of a future constitution, where, because what's happened is the entire SLPP and its policy program has failed completely. But yet they will keep going on about their mandate. So we have a mandate, we have to for 5 years. So now the American system has, for example, midterms. The UK have certain conditions where you can expel an MP, etc. So is there something that like this that might help in the future?
No, certainly. I mean, it's one thing that we have proposed in our in the policy document that we put out in 2019, and in the constitutional, some of we actually want a new constitution, not further amendments to this constitution. And in that new constitution, we have proposed the right to recall. Plus, there's something else that we are thinking about, which, I mean, all the technicalities of how to do this, including the recall clause, need to be worked out with constitutional experts. But one thing we are exploring the possibility of is, like, when a government comes up with their mandate, you know, their say Saubhagya or whatever else, periodically every election there is a mandate that they come out with, and that should become then something that is enforceable. So, for example, if it's linked in some way to the Constitution, to the fundamental rights chapter, that a citizen should be able to then take action or go to court to say that this mandate has not been implemented. So, if for instance, if they promise new houses and that's not happening, that should be something that a citizen should be able to take up legally. So clauses like that. So there are, I think, several ways in which we can have a constitution that makes elected members much more accountable to people.
I mean, what you say is completely true, because what we have right now is what I call a governance deficit. So basically, there's a whole group of MPs that are acting, against the will of the people, quite obviously.
Yes.
Now, as you said, the president is refusing to step down. He's in fact using the reason that we've called him a failure, but he's using the fact that he's a failure as the reason for not agreeing to go. So regardless, that doesn't make any logical sense. But if now you've just said the only way to get past this is maybe after an amendment to the Constitution to go for an election. Can the country afford an election? What is your thinking on this?
Yes, we think the country can afford an election. It requires about $12 billion, rupees for an election. The Prime Minister is proposing to print $1 trillion rupees, right? So if we think that political stability is essential for fixing the economic crisis as well. And if 12 billion is the cost of ensuring that the stability, then I think that's money well spent, right? Because the way things are going right now, we neither have political stability nor any prospect of this economic crisis being fixed in the long term or in the short term. So those who say that you cannot afford the election are people who don't want to go for an election.
It's in the media as well, no? And I think perhaps the question should be, can we afford to not have an election?
Exactly.
The way things are going.
Exactly.
Now, coming back to the Aragalaya, Dr. Harini, there's a narrative in the media about the Aragalaya being a JVP movement. So the media did a very, very easy link, right? As soon as there was violence, they linked it to the JVP or the IUSF. Now, and the Prime Minister, I think within a week of taking power, he was on international media calling the IUSF a militant organization very specifically. Now, could you just, for our audience, tell us about the JVP's involvement in the Aragalaya? And can you sort of comment on this idea that people had that the Aragalaya is apolitical? Now, apolitical or being apolitical, it's a tricky concept in itself, especially when you're talking about a very political issue. So could you just comment on the JVP's role and how you feel about the apolitical nature or the supposed apolitical nature of the Aragalaya?
Let me start with the second bit first, because I think that links to your question about the role of the JVP in the Aragalaya. I think apolitical is problematic because this is the Aragalaya that is calling for political reform, and that reform then requires you to take a political stand and a political position, right? So I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand what they mean when they say apolitical, right? And also it comes from this feeling that politics is bad, right? And that's problematic also. I think, but most people described it as non-partisan. That I think is fair enough, right? Because that Aragalaya had people who were part of political parties, who were not, who were independent, who were floating voters. It had everybody. So in that sense, the Aragalaya represented everybody, not necessarily one political party or movement. So in that sense, to describe it as non-partisan, I think is completely fine, because that was the reality, right? And that is the reality. And the JVP as well as the NPP were very, very sensitive to that notion of the Aragalaya being a non-partisan space and a non-partisan movement. But of course, many of our supporters were there. Many of our groups, our women's groups, our student groups, our cultural groups were part of the Aragalaya, right? They didn't go there carrying a JVP or an NPP flag. They were there as citizens, and they were there as members of an organization that subscribed to the values that were being advocated by the Aragalaya, right? And just as much as there were those from other political parties and movements as well, some who were obviously linked to a political party or movement and some who were not. So I don't see any problem in that, and I find this sort of post-May 9th sort of sudden, oh my gosh, the JVP was there, a bit naive, right? Of course the JVP was there, of course the FSP was there, so was the SJB, and so were lots of others.
Do you think the media drives a little bit?
Media drives it, but I think also this sort of, again, it's linked to that earlier thing that I talked about, like, and I think that's a very sort of, I'm sorry, I'm going to sound probably a little controversial here, but a very urban middle class thing that transformation, political transformation can somehow happen without the involvement of politics. That it's almost like it's some kind of NGO project, right? It's not. We are talking about structural change here. We are talking about political transformation, and that's not a project, right? So I think that's you won't find it and the Aragalaya is not confined to Golf-Face also. It's spread. And if you go out and you talk to people who've been part of this specific Go Home Aragalaya and beyond, they don't have the same sort of qualms or the same reaction to the presence of political parties in those spaces, right? So in that sense, then it was a very sort of easy and lazy link that the violence is attributed to the JVP or to the IUSF, right? And that completely kind of also misses the trigger to the incidents of the 9th.
It's a reaction.
It's a reaction. It was a response. And if you were there, if you saw what was going on, I think people responded very by instinct. I mean, I saw people rushing out of their office buildings to go join this because they heard that the space was being attacked. Right? I've met with people who said they were driving their cars when they heard, and they parked and they ran. Right? Because they felt personally attacked, and they felt this space needed to be protected. Right? Certainly then what happened in the evening went beyond that initial reaction of wanting to protect that space and to push back on an attack on a very peaceful protest site, right? And the violence, we condemn without reservation. That's not how we should do things in this country, but unfortunately that is how we have done things in this country. This is not the first time, right? And I think all of this need has raised the need for us to examine why we respond in those violent ways as a society, right? And I think it's very lazy to just sort of say, that's the JVP and that's the RUSF, and absolve ourselves and everyone else from that violence. And also it's very, very, it's completely then not taking into consideration the trigger in the morning, which was the cause of, the main cause for what happened thereafter.
Yeah, it seems a bit confused, no? Because on one side we're very happy that there's a diverse, eclectic crowd in Dargale. But when you find that, okay, there's different organizations, and then suddenly people take a small step back. So, but if we can get down to the current policy issues. Now, the NPP, the National People's Power, has been very vocal in its criticism of the International Monetary Fund. And there's been a very substantive debate, especially in the print media, regarding the dangers of an IMF-induced program of austerity. Could you tell us what the NPP's plan of action would be? Now, obviously, we've already approached the IMFs. A lot of people would say we should have approached them much before with our own plan, instead of going there sort of with our hands tied behind our backs. But what does the NPP current situation, how do they see the negotiations with the IMF?
See, I think at the outset, we must be clear. The NPP does not see the IMF as neither as a sort of a angel of mercy nor as a sort of devil in disguise, right? IMF is an international multilateral organization, and it has its own ideology and it has its agenda. There are things about it we disagree with, right? And that's why we think it should be, any engagement with the IMF has to be treated with caution, because in many ways there were certain policies of the IMF which has led to this economic crisis, right? And there are experiences in other parts of the world where IMF intervention at times of economic crisis have not necessarily led to the economic crisis being resolved, and in fact has led to a severe hardship for those who are most vulnerable and badly hit, right? So if we enter into discussions with IMF, then we have to enter that knowing all of this, right? And not expecting the IMF to be the sort of magic that's going to fix our economy. We have to fix our economy, not the IMF. The IMF can help us if we have a plan. And that's the problem that we have, that we are going to the IMF not without a proper plan of what we are going to do to fix the economy. So we are not sort of saying don't go to the IMF, or or nor are we saying the IMF is the only solution. Yes, of course we are in this situation. We are going to have to deal with all kinds of multilateral organizations, including the IMF. But we first need to have a clear idea of how we are going to fix this economy ourselves. We need to have answers when the IMF asks us about debt sustainability and how we are going to manage that, right? And that's a discussion we need to have.
Right. In the manifesto, it was called Rapid Responses, the manifesto by the National People's Power. It was released some months ago. In the opening sort of chapter, it says there's a critique of the 1977 open economy. Now, I'd like you to elaborate on this position because now in the economic stream, especially in commentary locally, the 1977 liberalization period is looked upon like Sri Lanka's golden policy era, where we sort of changed our mindsets and changed the structure of our economy. But of course, from that, I mean, there's also very clear academic literature on this, that inequality increased. And within 10 years, we had another major insurrection in the country after the 1977 open economy. So, and the NPP manifesto specifically states that Sri Lanka obviously needs to engage in global trade and to support its economic growth. So how does the NPP sort of balance the two? Because on one side, you critique the open economic policies, and we are in a fight to sort of open up our economy further, judging by what's going on. So how would you see that?
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's a mistake, or it's actually it's not at all helpful to talk about an open economy and a closed economy.
Yes.
I don't think there's anything that's either open nor closed. Not even in the sort of most capitalist of economies are fully open or fully, and neither are communist or socialist economies fully closed in that sense. That global trade is part of the economy, and any country has to engage with that. I think the question here is the role of the state and whom the state serves, right? And in what happened in 1977 with the liberalization of the economy was that this must also be said. Liberalization also, you can't generalize it. It's not as if every country had the same path and had the same consequences. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, where in most countries where liberalization led to the shrinking of the state, certainly that did not happen here. Right, our state expanded. Right, our state the role of the state grew even more. Right, so there are differences also that we need to take into account. So if anybody says that, liberalization led to a more efficient public sector, then where did that happen in Sri Lanka? Right, and now look at everything that they're talking about. All of this has happened. Whether it was maintaining the rupee at an artificial rate, all of those things happened within a so-called liberal economy, right? So I think these are very sort of not very useful the sort of terms to describe what is really going on. So for the NPP's critique of the liberalization program was what it did to the economy in terms of the loss in terms of the production part of the economy, right? We've grown heavily. The financialization of the economy has meant that we are increasingly dependent on imports. Also, we've been getting more and more into debt, and very unsustainable debts that haven't had given us any returns, right? Which has meant that this crisis is actually a consequence of all of those policies, right? And what you also pointed out in that, so though there has been an expansion of the economy, at the same time there's been a huge increase in inequality also. And some of our national indicators don't actually our national indicators mask some of the very severe inequalities that you have regionally or for specific groups, like for the estate sector or for the north and east, right? So we've had a real problem where our rural economy has remained impoverished, where our agriculture sector has declined, right? And that has had severe consequences for things like food security. Yeah. Things like the feminization of the economy, where like although more women have entered the labor market, they continue to be concentrated in low-paying, very exploitative work situations. So there are lots of things that is nothing to do with whether it's closed or open, right? The NPP policy is very clear that this is not about economic policy that is about shutting ourselves off, and it's not about a homegrown sort of solution where we produce everything we need and something like that. It's not that. And I think that's a very sort of very distorted view of what a progressive left-wing socialist economy looks like.
Right. Since you mentioned it, Can we at this point discuss the JVP's history of violence? And I'd like to consider this in two parts. Firstly, could you address how you personally and the National People's Power as a whole have reconciled the JVP's history of violence, considering you just mentioned yourself that the NPP is trying to occupy a progressive space within Sri Lanka's political spectrum. So based on this, and I wonder how, I'm sure you get this a lot, but could you, for our audience, tell us how you've personally and where the party as NPP members, or you're an academic, how do you see the history of violence versus the current face of the JVP, and do you think that that's something that's holding back the electoral success of the party?
I think that's, in a way, that we need as a society to come to terms with political violence, and that's not just the JVP, sure. Right? And it's very interesting that we only talk about the JVP violence when we know for a fact that even in the 88-89 insurrection, the state was primarily responsible for most of the deaths and disappearances. We ended a war leaving behind lots of unanswered questions, right? Political parties for years have engaged in political violence, but somehow when we talk about violence, we only talk about the JVP, right? So that in itself is, I think, extremely interesting about how we kind of choose which types of violence to talk about, especially given the fact that the JVP has not engaged in that type of violence in its political campaign since the 90s, since entering the democratic mainstream, right? Whereas there have been plenty of JVP members who've been targeted and killed by other political parties since.
Activists.
Right, and activists who've been disappeared, who've been killed since 88-89, right? So I think there needs to be a bit of, but certainly I think as a society we need to come to terms, and that includes the JVP, needs to come to terms with the violence of the past, and there needs to be some kind of maybe kind of a healing accountability process for the country as a whole, right? And that's something that I think we need, we really need, and that's something that the JVP would need to come to terms to for itself. I think there have been a lot of those discussions internally for the JVP, right? But those discussions have not happened with society, right? Also, the 80s period was a period where there were lots of militant groups, including state paramilitary groups that were deployed by the state. So that is why I'm again sort of emphasizing the fact that we as a society need to come to terms with our violent past, and not only the JVP. So for me, as someone who's part of the NPP, of which the JVP is one of the biggest groups, this is something that we talk about, but I also go by their current actions, right? And their current political behavior and practice, right? And that is far less violent, and violence is not just about physical violence, right? Violence is also about how you exclude people. Yes. Violence can also be structural violence. Different policies that you take on economics, on gender, can be very violent, right? And in that sense, I find that the JVP is far less violent and far more progressive than most other political parties. But I agree that the violence of the 80s is something that everybody, including the JVP, needs to reconcile much more openly.
The JVP NPP has been very clear on their position on the executive presidency.
Yeah.
Now, as it stands, it doesn't seem like the executive presidency is going anywhere. But the SJB, for instance, has talked about the three branches of government, the so-called Madisonian model, where the executive president has very specific powers. Is there any chance of the NPP, do you think that the NPP might compromise on this situation in the future? Why I asked Dr. Harini is because it seems that whenever, for example, when there's a political movement that wants to abolish the executive presidency. They seem to struggle to form a majority. This is just from what I've seen in the recent past. By and large, it seems that there's a rural-urban divide on this subject, where people outside 85% of Sri Lanka, 80% of Sri Lanka is rural, and a majority of that seem to see the presidency as sort of a guarantee for our Sinhala Buddhist nationalist project, if I may say that. So how do you confront people, because you have to obviously reach out to a lot of the rural areas, but how do you give them the comfort that, because they're obviously searching for this comfort, they're obviously searching for some sort of buffer or protective shield that the presidency seems to offer them. So how do you sort of focus on that specific conjecture?
Yeah, I mean, I think that version of why we need the executive presidency is something that came up quite recently, right? I mean, I'm thinking aloud here, but if you look at when the presidential system was introduced in 1978, there was a lot of resistance, and successive presidents, as you very well know, came into power, were elected on a very clear platform of abolishing the executive presidency. So I think, and I remember I was part of the Public Representations Committee on Constitutional Reforms in 2015, 2016, and we went to every district in the country. There was a lot of discussion about the need to abolish the presidency. So I think there's a critique of the executive presidency, which I think swung a little away from that critique in the 2019 election, post the Easter Sunday attacks, where there was this notion of a very insecure state and that you needed a strong man who could kind of provide security, right? Lo and behold, right? Two and a half years later, where are we, right? So I think I think that's open for discussion. I don't think there's any fixed thing among the public in relation to know that the executive presidency provides security, or, as you said, furthers the Sinhala Buddhist project, nationalist project. So for the NPP, we are very clear that the executive presidency has to be abolished. What then needs to replace it is something that we are open to discuss. And in fact, what we proposed when we came out with the proposal on the 11th of May, after the May 9th incident, one of the things that we said was that along with the 21st Amendment, Parliament needs to move a motion to abolish the presidency, and that we should have a general election and a referendum on that on the same day at the same time, right? To get a mandate for abolishing the presidency. But Ranil Wickremesinghe taking on the Prime Ministership later that same day, I think completely diverted attention from the proposal that we had put forward at about 10 in the morning that day. Right. By afternoon, situation had changed so drastically that that discussion never took place.
Is there an opportunity for the National People's Power to form a working coalition with, for example, the SJB? Now, I know that if that happens, if you currently, based on the current dynamics, the SJB and the NPP together alienates a lot of the parties and personalities that have worked very closely with the Rajapaksa regime, not just this time, but in previous regimes as well. The NPP and even the SJB, judging by your own manifesto, it's quite a moderate manifesto. I wouldn't say that there's a lot of socialism in it, etc. There's certainly no talk of tearing down capitalism and installing a communist structure. So both the SJB and the NPP to me seem politically somewhat moderate, but there has been no even conversation around a coalition to take on the Rajapaksa establishment and the board too. How do you see that dynamic?
Yeah, we're very wary of coalitions among political parties for several reasons. One being that I think the mood of the Aragalaya, and this is something that before the Aragalaya also we've been talking about, is that our mainstream political parties are corrupt. corrupt, and I don't mean corrupt in that it only take, about financial corruption, but corrupt in every sense, right? And political, and in a way, the NPP is an effort to establish a political movement and a political party that is different to the sort of traditional political parties, right? In not only when it comes to anti-corruption with regard to finances, but more inclusive, more sort of open to sort of a less hierarchical, more democratic structure, right? So in that sense, there's a real mismatch in the way we operate, right? How the NPP operates and how any of the traditional parties operate. And I mean, the SJB is not new in that sense. The SJB is, as far as I'm concerned, the UNP by another name, right? Not much has changed. My colleagues in the SJB might beg to differ, but from outside, that's what it seems. There's no real change in terms of the culture of SJB, right? And so there's then a real mismatch in the way we operate, how our decision-making structures, the way in which the leader of the party operates, and the power that the leader maintains. It's very different, right? So then it doesn't make for an easy partnership or a easy sort of coalition building strategy, right? But I think what we will do and what we are doing is that we do cooperate on issues as and when they come up, right? And we work with members of the SJB in Parliament when necessary. But a coalition is a little more difficult.
Would you consider agitating together, say on the roads, having a joint sort of thing? Because it just seems a very convenient time, because everybody that has had any connection with the Rajapaksas is on one side, and everybody who hasn't is sort of on this side. So there's a nice parallel that could be drawn.
No, we wouldn't rule that out. We wouldn't rule that out. But then once again, that I would again come back to the culture of protest, right? The NPP culture of protest is slightly different to the SJB. I mean, we don't come with like security. We don't come with posters of ourselves, right? Okay. It's much more. The protests are much more organic, right? And so if we can move beyond those issues, I mean, I wouldn't rule out protests together, but there's a sort of a slight cultural mismatch.
Look, I noted a print interview of yours from 2020, where you stated an interest, just since we're talking about activism and agitation, you stated an interest in, and I quote, the literature on activism and the link between activism and emotions, intimacy and relationships, what you call the sociality of activism. So how do you see Sri Lankans and social activism? I mean, I've personally grown up in a somewhat liberal environment within Colombo. Sri Lankan society, to me, has always seemed a little bit pacifist. There's so many obvious corruption scandals that happen, and we don't generally take those things very seriously. We've kind of taken it as part of the furniture now, being corrupt. Now, there is a climate of impunity for politicians. There was an apathy by the general public. How do you see this having changed in 2022? I think you mentioned it briefly before, where do you think we as a population have turned a corner?
Oh, for sure. I think we have, and I think that was what was the most inspiring about the Aragale, and what for the NPP we found so sort of affirming, because these were issues that we have been talking about, and it felt that we were the only ones talking about it. But here now suddenly the entire country is using these slogans that we've been using by ourselves for several years. So it was great. So I think the Aragale is a turn in that it's signaling, it's symbolizing a kind of difference or a difference in kind of political values and political culture that is very significant, right? And I think on the 9th of May, what was attacked was not just the physical structures of the Aragale, but the kind of this might sound a little dramatic, but the soul of the Aragale.
I understand.
right? It turned what was very sort of peaceful and creative and an experiment even with a very different way of doing politics into a very violent space. And you can see post-9, even in the Aragala space, how the impact that has had. They've taken some time, and I don't think it's fully resolved yet about how to get back to that pre-9th way of organizing and being in that space. I mean, the one specific difference is that pre-May 9th, there were lots of young women there who were taking the lead, who were leading some of the activities that were going on, and that was, I think, largely because it was such a peaceful, inclusive space, right? Post-9th, I think it's shifted a little bit, and that's very unfortunate. And I think that's the real damage to the Aragalya, right? That happened with the violence unleashed by the temple trees.
Okay. I'm just going to read an introduction, the abstract actually, from a 2010 article by yourself and another author. Quote, when it comes to women, Sri Lanka has always been talked about as an anomaly. Despite having one of the lowest levels of women's political participation in the region, reportedly high levels of domestic violence as well as rising rates of suicide among young women, it is still seen as a success story in the region. For it has some of the highest indicators of women's performance in the education, employment and health sectors, in addition to several high-profile female heads of state. Sri Lanka does not appear on the cultural radar with sensational gender issues such as incidences of dowry death, sati, female infanticide, female genital mutilation, honor killings, etc. Sri Lanka is ranked 99th in the Gender Empowerment Index, ahead of South Asian neighbors. The impression is of a progressive country, at least as far as women are concerned. This is from your paper, Why Aren't We Empowered Yet, 2010. Now, Sri Lanka has a history, Dr. Harini, of many females in high positions. I'll just list off Siva Dasanayaka, Ms. Vimala Vijayawardena, Vivian Gunawardena, Selina Pereira, before we even come to Sirimawa and Chandrika. So are Sri Lankans really aware of the revolutionary role that some women have played in Sri Lanka's history and political development? And why is there so few female representatives in the Sri Lankan political system relative to our head start with regional peers?
That's an excellent question. I think one of the reasons is the decline of the left movement since the 70s, because if when you read out all those names,
yes, all left,
all left, right? And because most of the strongest, most activist sort of women's movements came from left political parties, and I think the sort of the decline of the left post 1977 had an impact on that, and led to many women activists becoming part of, if I may say, the development and NGO sector, right? So then feminist politics became NGO-fied, right? Not necessarily, I'm not saying that that's good or bad or right or wrong, but then the nature of feminist politics changed, and it was taken outside of the political parties of mainstream politics into like the sort of boardrooms and the whatevers of the development sector, right? And meant that it kind of got, in a way, disassociated from politics. Being feminist and transformative work in relation to gender became depoliticized, right? And I think that's problematic. Okay, so in a way, that's one of the main reasons.
I wonder if I may ask, do you think it has something to do with how society conditions women to favor different streams, or is there something innate? For example, are women generally speaking just not as interested in politics for whatever reason? Do they find it to be frivolous, or is it simply that given the burdens of, for example, raising a family and managing a home, plus a husband, plus a career, perhaps politics just doesn't seem very important to them? So maybe is it a point of us showing more young girls and women out there that politics can really make a difference in their lives?
I think all of what you said, certainly the sort of burden of the care work, restricts women's entry into politics. But then also the fact that politics, and I think this is not just for women, but where politics itself is seen as a violent, corrupt, dirty space, no one in their right minds would enter a political space, right? So you become sort of, even what we talked about earlier, this sort of very self-conscious need to maintain Aragalia as apolitical by some, right, when it's clearly not apolitical. But this sort of this dismissal of politics is something that in some ways, and I'm not sure whether we have time to go into this, is a part of sort of the neoliberal culture, where transformation doesn't happen through political transformation, but through sort of individual self-improvement, right? So you sort of have less emphasis on solidarity, movement building, collective organizing, right? And that impacted on politics in general, especially for women who thrive in kind of collective work, in solidarity building, in movements, right? Because it's those networks that have sustained and helped them to be engaged in work outside in the public, right? So I think there's all of those reasons which have led to such a poor representation of women in the political space.
And that's there are very specific issues such as the tax on sanitary napkins. Now, it's a very straightforward issue. It's not really been engaged in any meaningful way by many MPs. How do you change representation? I mean, are you a fan of a quota system, or do you sort of look at maybe political party nominations procedures, and is that a way we could? The quota system has its drawbacks, does it not? So how do you?
It has its drawbacks, but given our current woefully inadequate female representation in Parliament, I think a quota is not in Parliament, in any elected body or in any decision-making institution or body. I think quotas are not necessarily a bad thing and are necessary. But quotas is not the be-all and end-all of women's representation. I think we also need to take account of making it more possible for women to be active politically and not necessarily be elected also, right? I mean, participation in politics is not only about electoral politics, right? It's a much wider, bigger space, and I think if you want to really look at it, there are lots of women who are active in those spaces who are not necessarily in electoral politics. So we can't discount that, right? So there's that, and the other thing that you said, political party structure and political party culture, yes, which makes it very, very different. So that's not going to be just fixed by quotas alone, right? That requires a lot more work and a lot of hard work into actually changing those structures that keep women out of mainstream politics.
If I can finish off, Dr. Harini, as I mentioned, you're an academic. You've had a career in activism before, but being an academic, you had a career laid out in front of you. But you could have made tenure, perhaps become a professor, etc. But you've chosen a different field. Some would say a very challenging field. You could have been very comfortable, yes, as an academic. Was there any, not just female politicians, but anybody that inspired you to enter the political arena or to become more engaged, since you were always an activist of sorts? But did something push you to take that next step? And how would you sort of advertise this career to other women who might be interested? Because I think it's important that they hear from you.
Yeah, it wasn't one single person who inspired me. I think there was a lot of factors, lots of things that happened that pushed me to take this decision. And as you say, a decision that has led me to a much less predictable life than before. One was I've seen and I've experienced and I've met so many people in the course of my work with the JVP and then with the NPP who've sacrificed far more, and whose commitment to a particular vision of how they see this country should change has been very inspiring. People who have had far more to lose than I have had, right? And then when you see that, and when you see that commitment, And that commitment with such long odds, like after successive defeat, after being at the end of state violence for decades, and they're still sort of committed to that political change, and then you kind of feel a bit privileged.
I'm interested because actually the names I mentioned, Siva Dasanayake, Vimala Vijayawardena, Vivian Gunawardena, all from fairly aristocratic backgrounds, very comfortable lives they could have led. Instead, a lot of them were involved in at the sharp end of revolution. I mean, Selina Pereira, for instance, fled to India when she was on the run from the Sri Lankan government. So I suppose there's room for improvement, but with examples like yourself, I think hopefully women have more reason to enter the political sphere.
Well, I think we should all take the plunge, not just women and men, but if you think that things need to change, that's not going to change without a bit of discomfort and without some kind of I hate to call it sacrifice, because it's not as if you're not reward. I mean, there are no rewards in this. There's an excitement.
I'm sure it's very rewarding, actually.
There's an energy and an excitement in this field that you don't get anywhere else. You do get it as a teacher also. I acknowledge that, but you do have that similar sort of energy in doing politics, because you're transforming. You feel you're part of a movement. You feel you're part of something that has the potential for great change, right? And that's always hugely inspiring in and of itself, right? So I would encourage anyone who wants a different kind of world to take the plunge. There's no other way.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Harini. Appreciate it, and thank you for your service, and thank you very much for being here with us on Insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kusum.
Thank you.